Hey guys, kinggath here with Bethesda Mod School. In this lesson, I'm going to cover a bunch of different little tiny topics, and these are going to be related to things to improve your general workflow and get you a good work environment so that you can work a little more quickly. And I'm going to show you a handful of third-party tools so that you can do more things. So the things we're going to cover in this particular lesson are, I'm going to show you how to unpack all of the Fallout 4 files so that you can get easy access to them. I'm going to show you how to set up some of the major Fallout 4 formats of files to open directly into the appropriate software. I'm going to show you how to correctly export texture files so that you don't get the rainbow texture bug. I am going to show you how to configure Nifskope so that you can see the textures of the model files you're opening. I'm also going to show you, while we're in Nifskope, how to change the models to point at new materials. So if you're making retextures, you can do that. And then I'm going to show you a program called Material Editor, which is a great, easy-to-use program for generating new material files, especially if you need to base them off of vanilla ones. So all of this stuff in total will help you do quicker work. It will help you experiment more because you'll have easier access to all the files and to preview them, and it will help you to make custom textures because a lot of the stuff I'm going to happen to show you will all tie together to let you make textures, set up the material file, and add them to a model. And if you combine all of that with the material swap video that I did, you will have a lot more power and can do a lot of stuff with this new knowledge. All right, so let's jump in and start with the extracting all of the files, because these are going to be really useful if you're going to start getting into anything like texture editing. So if you go into your Fallout 4 data folder, which is under your Steam Apps Common folder, you will find that there are all these files called BA2. Now, if you've got mods installed, you'll see tons of different mod files, and it might be hard to find the ones that start with Fallout 4. And so you can filter up in the data box, the search data box up at the top right, if you're on Windows 10, for Fallout 4, and then asterisk, like the wildcard symbol, .ba2, and you'll bring up just the vanilla files. So there's a lot of different stuff here. I like to just extract everything, and that's because once you extract the textures, you're already up to about 35 gigabytes, so then it's just a couple of gigabytes more to get all the rest of the files. So almost all of Fallout 4 is just texture files. Now, what I'm going to show you here, even if you don't have 40-ish gigs to spare to extract all this, it's still useful to know if you want to extract individual files, so bear with me here, even if you're not one with excessive hard drive space available. So the first thing I'm going to show you how to do is something I'm going to show you several times in this video, which is how to set a default file format. This is a very simple operation. A lot of you guys, I'm sure, know how to do this in Windows, but just in case there's somebody who doesn't, this is such a huge time saver. And when you're modding and you're dealing with things that are frustrating, like while you're trying to learn, it's great to try and streamline some of the simpler things so that they aren't driving you nuts. One of those things I find is making as many files as possible double clickable. It just makes it easier to experiment. I don't get annoyed with having to go open up software and then navigate to things all the time. I can just navigate directly to them, double click them, and I've got them open. So it just shaves off some potential nuisance later in your life. So what you want to do is grab one of these BA2 files and right click it and hit open with. And now for me, I've already got Archive 2 showing up here because I've already set this up on this computer. But what you'll find on most of your computers is that those BA2 files are either going to have a generic icon as if they're not going to open and you're going to just get this window, or they'll try and open in the creation kit. Neither is helpful. So once you've got this, how do you want to open this file window up? Check in this always use this app to open BA2 files, then scroll down to more apps, and you're going to go to look for another app on this PC. And then you're going to navigate to your Fallout 4 installation directory, which for most of you is going to be under Program Files x86, and then Steam Apps, Common, Fallout 4. Now, presumably, if you followed my tutorial for getting set up with the Creation Kit, you will have installed the Creation Kit directly into your Fallout 4 directory, and this just makes it a lot easier to work with, and it makes it more predictable where everything's going to be. In this case, the program I'm going to show you is in your Tools directory under Fallout 4, and then Archive 2, and then you just double-click that. And now what will happen is all of your BA2 files will get associated with Archive 2, so at any time you can double-click one to just open it right up, and this is really, really useful, especially once you get into creating your own archive files for your mods. All right, so then from here, once you have one of these open, you can click the archive menu, hit extract all to, and you'll be able to extract it anywhere you want. Now, what I recommend you do as a location to extract everything is to create a folder on one of your drives wherever you've got a lot of space. If you've got a lot of space on an SSD drive, that'll make your life a lot simpler. I currently do not, so I'm putting it on a SATA drive. And what I tend to do with Bethesda games is I create a folder for that particular game called whatever unpacked. So I have one for Fallout 4, I have one for Fallout 76, I have one for Skyrim, And I basically just create that unpacked folder. Then I create a data folder underneath of that, and that's where I extract everything to. So then from here, I would hit archive, extract all to, and navigate to this data folder. And the reason for putting that second data folder underneath is that if I ever need to package up any of these files later, I can do so direct from here by dragging and dropping from here right into archive 2, and I don't have to worry about the path being screwed up because archive 2 assumes that the data directory is the top level. So it basically ignores everything before data and only grabs after. So then it ends up being perfectly organized for when you need to release your mod. So that's why I tend to do that. Is anytime I'm dealing with Fallout 4 files, I make sure that, or any Bethesda mod files, I make sure that the top level directory is always the folder called data. So you can do that for each of these. Just open them up one at a time. Once you hit it, and I'll go ahead and do this just so you can see what will happen. You'll get this extract pop up here. Just wait for that to finish before you continue or before you close this particular thing. You can actually open up multiple instances of Archive 2 and have multiple extracting at once, though it depends on how fast your hard drive is of whether that'll have actually any positive impact or not. But I tend to do that with the textures, just open one at a time and do that because it takes quite a while to extract them all, and that way I can just set them going and then walk away from my computer. So then when it's done there, that little thing will close and you can just exit out of that particular instance of Archive 2. And then once you have all of these files here, they're easily accessible. And I'm going to show you throughout the video how you can turn some more of these different files under here into things you can double click on so that you can get access to those a little more quickly, which makes it real nice for browsing. So once you've got everything unpacked, it's great to be able to come through here and just look at some of the different files and be able to double click them and see what they are and get previews of them. And then that might spark some ideas, some things you might have not thought about. You might stumble upon some unused assets that inspire you. It's a lot of fun to go through and dig through these files, and it makes it a lot easier to do if they're already extracted. So if you don't have all that space, the other thing you'll find is that on this archive menu, if you select any number of files, and you can do that by clicking them, holding the shift key and grabbing a bunch, or you can hold control and click on individuals, then you're going to get the extract selected to option, and then you can extract just the individual files you specifically want, so you don't have to do the full archive and waste a ton of hard drive space for stuff you're not going to use. The ones that most of you will want access to will probably be materials, meshes, and textures. A lot of this other stuff is not going to be useful to a ton of you. If you're interested in doing quest mods where you use the player's voice or you repurpose vanilla lines, you're probably going to want the voices. If you want to do some edited sound stuff, you could grab the sounds. But a lot of this other stuff is pretty advanced. Like I don't recommend people generally mess with the interface files just because then you're going to introduce all sorts of compatibility issues. Animations tend to be files that you're not going to be editing directly anyway, and the conversion process for them is a little rough, though we will cover that at some point for the handful of you that actually know 3D Studio Max enough to do some animations, but that's probably going to be a ways down the road. All right, so that covers how you extract those files. Now let's move on to textures. So one of the most common problems I see in mods with people just getting started with this, just getting started with modding, is having textures that turn into like this rainbowy effect where it's got a bunch of little dots in different colors, and as you get closer or far away from the model, the texture seems to kind of warp in and out of that format. This is almost always an issue of compression. So whether it's you chose the wrong compression of the texture when you created it, or you compressed your BA2 file incorrectly. So for example, if you accidentally left the compression type in your textures file as normal, and if you don't know what I'm talking about with the compression of your BA2 files, go check out the tutorial I did called Creating BA2 Files. I believe that's what it's titled. And it basically goes over how you create these yourself. And you have to create one for textures and one for all the rest of your files. And the textures require certain compression. So beyond that archive issue, which I've already covered, let's go into how you correctly export from Photoshop. I know this is a common question everybody runs into, and there are definitely a lot of different ways that you can get kind of screwed up from it because there are so many options. In fact, there are even multiple plugins to choose from. So I'm going to wholeheartedly recommend Intel's TextureWorks plugin. Now, I'm told the reason that it works better than the other one available, which is from NVIDIA, is because it has the appropriate compressions that Fallout 4 expects, whereas NVIDIA does not have all of the same compressions available. And so you'll find that some textures will work from the NVIDIA plugin and some won't, whereas as long as you follow the settings I'm going to show you, all of them should work from the Intel TextureWorks plugin. So this plugin does work. I've tested it up through Photoshop 2019 from Creative Cloud. So if you are on an earlier version, they quote it working as far back as 2014 on their site. But I'm mentioning that I worked up through 2019 because you might see this only mentioning 2014 and thinking this is an old plugin. It still does work. So you can just follow these exact instructions. I'll have this linked in the description. And you can follow these instructions to get this installed, and it should work just fine. Just make sure that you have Photoshop closed when you install this. All right, so if you don't have money to burn on Creative Cloud or a Photoshop license, or you don't use it enough for that to be worthwhile, you have access to a program called GIMP. This is a free piece of software. I'm not very familiar with it, so I'm only going to roughly go over how you do it through GIMP because I don't want to mislead anybody, and it's not my strong suit. And most of the people I asked about the texture workflow to get this down to make sure I was able to give a proper tutorial on it also used Photoshop, so I didn't have a ton of information available on GIMP. The one thing that I have found on it is that there is a DDS plugin for it. Obviously, that's going to be important if you're going to create the texture files DDS, which is what Fallout 4 is looking for. And while it looks old, it actually does work with the current version of GIMP. So this I will have linked below as well. And you basically choose either Windows 64-bit binaries if you're on a modern Windows 10 computer, or if you happen to be on an old Windows 32 or Windows 7 32-bit build, or maybe they have a Windows 10 32-bit. I don't believe they do, but either way, you'll choose your appropriate 64 or 32-bit under the binaries here, download that, and install it after you install GIMP. So I've got GIMP installed as well as the plugin, so I can show you real quickly how you do it, but there's probably some specific details that you're going to need to find somebody else who knows more about GIMP in order to show you this, especially with alpha textures, but I can at least show you how to do real basic textures with GIMP. All right, so let's start by launching Photoshop, and I'm going to walk you through some of the presets. Now, I actually acquired these presets thanks to Wanamingo. Wanamingo is a mod author that does a lot of textures for different mods. He's worked on some settlements. He works a lot with weapon mod authors, just a very helpful person, and he made sure that I had the exact correct settings for exporting so that you can do all the different texture types. So I'm going to walk you through those now. So once you have your file created, now mine I've already saved as a DDS, but you can basically do anything you want in Photoshop. I mean, you can use all your layers, you can use your alpha channels, everything you know about Photoshop still applies for when you're creating these textures. It's literally just this last export step where it matters. Now with GIMP, there is a requirement that before you export, you have to flatten the image, but we'll cover that when we get to GIMP. So let's go ahead and hit Save As up here. And you can see I've already got it selected, but there is you'll find an Intel TextureWorks in the dropdown, and if you don't, that means you installed that plugin incorrectly. So then you name your file and click Save. Yes, I'll go ahead and replace this, and you will get this little pop-up here. Now, the best part about this pop-up is this preset settings, because basically, once you set this up once, you can save these, and then you don't have to memorize them, which is a problem I had. I wasn't saving the presets, and I finally, after Wanamingo showed me all the correct settings, I saved them all, so I didn't have to keep looking them up. So we've got 4 different settings here, and I'm going to walk through what each of them is. So for those of you who are graphic hardcore people, you really want your stuff to just look its absolute best, you don't care about file size, so maybe you're not aiming for an Xbox crowd, you're going to want to choose this first option. Now, obviously, you guys don't have these presets, so I'm going to just show you them one at a time, and all you would do is fill out your drop-down menus the same as you see mine, click Save, and then you can just type in the name, and you can name them whatever you want. So I call this one Diffuse No Alpha High Quality, so this is going to be maximum quality. And my texture doesn't require an alpha channel, so I don't have anything that needs to be see-through. Everything is just a solid texture. This is most textures, and these are the without the alpha saves a lot of space, so it's best to not save with alpha if you're not using an alpha channel because you're just wasting space then. So for texture type, you're going to just choose color. And then under compression, you're going to choose BC7. Now, the trick here is that there are 4 different BC7s. You want the second one generally, and I'm going to read off exactly the one we're choosing because it's possible that a new version of this plugin changes the order at some time or at some point, or introduces additional new stuff as new tech becomes available, and I want this tutorial to continue to work into the future. So you're going to choose the one that's BC7, 8 BPP, fine, and then in parentheses, linear DirectX 11 plus. So that's the one we want, and that is going to be the best possible texture quality you can get in Fallout 4. And then the other thing to watch out for is making sure you have auto-generate on MIP maps. If you fail to include MIP maps, you're going to end up causing serious VRAM issues for people because they essentially are going to have the full-size texture loaded at all times whenever anything using your texture is within rendering distance, whereas the mipmaps basically create scaled-down versions of the textures that the game engines can load on the fly, depending on the distance that the items are from your camera. And it's a little more technical, but that's a rough enough explanation of what it does. So that's our first one. So that's the most common. Now, for those of you guys like me who is a sucker for Xbox and really wants to help those people with their texture or with their texture space, we don't want to overdo it because they have that really unfortunate 2 GB limit. You're going to want to switch to the diffuse no alpha small size, and that's basically the same settings for texture type and mipmaps, but you're going to go right down to compression BC1. This is a much lower quality. You're definitely going to lose a little bit of color fidelity, but if you're a fan of sim settlements and none of the textures have particularly bothered you and you thought that they looked pretty decent, that's what I use for as much as I can for sim settlements where I don't have alpha textures, and I think stuff turns out pretty darn good. But obviously, if you really want that high quality, if you're going to be playing in 4K or you're trying to make high-end textures, then that BC7 is going to be where it's at. So depending on which one you are, those are the two most common that you'll be using. Now, for those of you who have been following along and wondering what the hell this first word means, diffuse, that's the general texture. That's just the common colored texture you see on most objects. The other texture types are normal maps, which require or basically give things kind of a feel that they have a texture to them. Things like a leather or maybe like the grain and sand. There's all sorts of things you can do with normal maps to make the texture feel like it has kind of a three-dimensional feel to it. Specular maps are how light affects the particular item, and then glow maps show how things glow in the dark. And so the normal and spec maps are going to use a different setting, and glow maps will actually use the same settings as the diffuse. Now, there's one other diffuse I'm going to show you, and that's the alpha channel. So if you happen to have one that has some see-through elements in it where you really need that alpha channel, you basically change texture type to color plus alpha, and then you're going to be limited going back to BC7. You don't have the BC1 option. So that's the only difference there. And then the last one I'll show you here, this is one, most of you aren't going to use this, and most of you are never going to create normal and specular maps, though there are some great tutorials covering normal and specular and glow map tutorials on the Nexus. So if you're ever looking for information on something that I haven't covered yet, and you just need to get that information to proceed forward, head to the Nexus mods section, go to mods by category, and there's a modders resource and tutorials, and almost every little niche thing that people have discovered in the community somebody has put out a tutorial, and it might not be the easiest to follow, but the information is available generally in that category. Like I said, one of the reasons I'm creating this particular series is I want a linear place for you guys to find all of this stuff, so where those of you who dive into modding and just follow all these tutorials eventually will stumble upon all of that, because I'm going to go dig it up for you, but obviously this is going to take a long time to get through. So if you're looking for specific information you can't find, that is a wonderful place to go to. So normal and specular maps, you basically use the normal map drop down for texture type and BC5 as your compression. I don't know how these things work, the normalize, flip X, flip green. I know that there's a lot that goes on with basically reusing certain channels to pull off crazy stuff with these. This is outside of my area of expertise. I think that if you are a serious modeler enough to be making normal and spec maps, you understand this stuff and can handle that. I do also know that the Rizzler has covered this stuff briefly in his weapon tutorial series, which I linked in my intro video, so maybe go check that if that's something you're interested in. But the trick with that there is BC5 is the format that you use, and the texture type as normal map. So cube maps, something I have no idea how they work. I don't know what they're for. I'm not going to touch those. That's even more advanced than all of this stuff. So this should cover most of your needs, though. All right, so now let's go into GIMP for those of you guys who don't have Photoshop, so I can show you quickly how you would do that. So the first thing to know is that you need to merge down your image. So you need to merge everything down into a single layer. So I only have one layer, so it's not showing, but if you were going to, before you would create this, you're going to want to merge it down. So probably best to save a second copy of this so that you don't actually overwrite your working copy with all your layers, and you're going to merge it down. That's the safest way to make sure that you don't get any game crashes or wonkiness. Then next, you're going to go to File and Export As. And then we're going to just go ahead and go into our little folder here, and we'll just save over our one. So once you get it and you name it and you hit Export, you're going to get this pop up with the DDS options, and this is where you'll find similar options to the Photoshop. One thing you'll notice that's missing is the BC7, and that's kind of a disadvantage. You don't have the ability to save in that really high quality. So if you're going to be serious about textures, you're going to want to get a hold of Photoshop. Or there's probably, I'm sure there are other pieces of software besides Photoshop that also have plugins for this, but these are the two that I'm aware of. I assume that if you're a high enough end user and texture artist, you know of those options. I don't need to tell you. So if you're looking for a freebie, you're going to have a little bit of sacrifice in quality. And so you're going to want to go to this BC1 compression, choose generate maps. And then I've been told, and I don't use GIMP, so I can't confirm this, but I've been told it's good to use this use perceptual error metric, which helps with the compression. If you find that starts crashing your game, definitely just go back and uncheck that and not use that. You're going to be more likely to find information on GIMP from other users in the community. And if you have joined our Discord server for helping mod authors, there are definitely people there who use it that I just didn't get information from before I made this video, so I don't have confirmation, but they can correct me on anything I'm wrong with here because I'm sure they've gone through these trials and tribulations. But I wanted to at least show you where that export setting was because it's not obvious. It's not on the save menu like you would find in Photoshop. So it is possible to create working textures for Fallout 4 in GIMP, so you don't actually have to spend any money on any tools. In fact, the next two tools I'm going to show you are actually community made and completely free. All right, so we've shown you how to extract files, we've shown you how to do textures, and let's talk about now how you can set up those textures to auto open. So the same way that you did it with the BA2 files, if we go into this unpacked directory and just find a random texture in here somewhere, so let's find a DDS file, we can do the same thing we did with the other thing. We can hit open with, and then we can select. So in this particular case, it's giving me a side little drop-down menu. So you can actually suggest, or you can select the GNU image manipulation program, which is what GIMP stands for, or Photoshop will probably be the default, but depends on probably when you installed it, when DDS file, or which plugins you had installed for DDS and whatnot. I find that it tends to automatically map to Photoshop when I double click on them, but it's a good idea to go ahead and double click those. And I believe Windows natively can display these DDS files so that you can actually preview them like I have here, where I just have my view setting to one of the icons, and then I can actually see a preview of the textures so that you can actually quickly look through textures without having to do anything else other than extract them, which is nice. All right, so let's go to the next program on our list. So we had Intel TextureWorks, GIMP, the GIMP DDS file, and then the next one I wanted to show you was Material Editor, and this is by Osnius, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but this is a material file editor created in the community. I find it way easier to use than the one that Bethesda includes with the creation kit, so I highly recommend this. And this is a software that you can run from anywhere. You don't have to have it installed. It's literally just a config file in exe. You just extract them wherever you want. I like to keep all of my third-party tools in the Fallout 4 tools directory just so I know they're all in the same spot. So with Material Editor, if you double-click it and run that, you can basically open up different material files. And the material files essentially define a bunch of information about a texture and how it should be used, and they're a great way to swap things over so that you don't have to increase a lot of texture space, but you can still get a lot more options. And if you're familiar, or if you want to know how to create the swaps in the creation kit, I've covered that in another tutorial. In this, all I'm going to show you is how to take the material from a model that you're retexturing and repurpose it so that your material file points to your new copy of the texture. So let's start by doing what we've just shown you with the DDS files in showing how to mark those open with. You can do the same thing with this material editor program. So if we go into materials and we find an arbitrary material, and then we'll right click it and hit open with, and we're going to hit choose another app. And just like before, we can navigate all the way to our Fallout 4 tools directory, and we can point to that third-party app, which I think is really powerful because then you can just double-click those material files and open them wherever you happen to find them. So sometimes you'll find them they're loosely in your data folder because a mod didn't create a BA2 file. Sometimes you'll find them because you're grabbing the vanilla ones from Bethesda, but it's great to be able to just double-click those. So we're going to go into Steam Apps, Common, Fallout 4, Tools, and then we're going to go into Material Editor. Oops, and I see the Material Editor default one is the Bethesda created one, so we want Material Editor.exe, and then you'll get this nice program, which you will open up, and you will see that there is a set of tabs here. The first one has a bunch of different information. I'm not going to cover all this stuff right now. I may in the future, but I might also just leave that to people who know this stuff better. What I tend to do is I find a texture that is doing something similar to what I want, and then I take its material file and just resave it. So then I would go File, Save As, and I would save it under my own particular directory with the name of the folder or the name of the file that I want to use. So then I'm just editing basically the diffuse texture generally. So you go on the material tab and you can change the actual texture file you're pointing to, and you can click this little box on the right here and it will allow you to navigate to your texture file. And that's that simple. You can just go ahead and point it to your texture. It will update this particular setting here. And this is another one of those points where another one of those programs where it uses the data folder as your top level. So another good habit to get into is keeping everything below a data folder. So it would be data and then materials, and then these are all your subfolders underneath data and materials. This will do the same type of thing. So this program is fantastic. It makes it real easy to just swap over the material file. So you would take the material of the texture you were making a replacement for and then point it to it. And if you were making custom textures, you might end up having to set up more of these fields. And in that case, again, I would find a material file that already does something similar to what you want, and then go ahead and point your different texture files to these fields in this material editor. Then all of this stuff, you've got all these different options. Again, very advanced stuff. There's some really cool stuff you can do. And as I come across examples of specifics where that might be useful to show you, where I'm showing you a specific trick, I will go over that. But I don't know how useful it would be to explain what each of these fields do, because first of all, I'm not 100% certain on all of them. And second, it would just be a lot of white noise to most of you. And those of you who understand this stuff, I'm not telling you anything new anyway. So the primary thing is using this material tab to point to your different textures. And you find that on some textures, more of these things are filled out. Like here's where you do the glow texture. In rare occasions, you'll find things like the wrinkles texture. Environment map is a little more commonly used. Grayscale texture tends to be used on effects more than anything else. But for the most part, this diffuse texture is all you're going to need to edit. All right, so that's where you would go to edit your material file so that you can point to your custom textures. All right, now we're going to set up Nifskope. And Nifskope is the program that you can use to view and also do some tweaking to the mesh files that Bethesda creates. And this is available on GitHub. I will link this below. I really like the 2.0 Dev 7 version. I have not found any bugs in it yet. It seems to run really well, and it's the last version we've had for quite some time. From what I understand, the developer's taken a break from development on it, but that may have changed by the time you guys watch this. And this particular build, even though it's a dev build, so generally I would recommend people go and use the released builds, but I think this dev build is really, really powerful. It works really well, and it adds some extra features, which I don't remember which features it's added because I've used them for so long, but I find this build to be really, really worth using. And maybe it won't work for Skyrim, but for Fallout 4, it definitely seems to be very stable. And I do all of the sim settlements editing with Nif work in this particular version. So once you install Nifscopes, once you've downloaded and installed it, and if you're not familiar with downloading files from GitHub, you tend to just click on the name of the file. It will take you to the list of all of the changes that it's had. And then generally now down near the bottom, you'll find a exe or a 7-zip or zip file you can download. So in this case, we've got this Nifskope 2.0 2018 build. You can download that 7-zip file and extract it. So once you've got this extracted somewhere, much like the material editor from Osneus, you can just extract it wherever you want. You don't actually have to run an installer. And so there's a couple of things I would do here. The first thing I would do is open up Nifskope, and we're going to go into options and then settings. And then under resources here, so you're going to have these three tabs. You can click on resources and first hit auto detect game paths and see if it finds your paths automatically for you. If it doesn't, then you're going to want to click add folder, and you're going to want to add, I like adding these two particular folders. I found that sometimes you only need one, sometimes you need both. I don't know what the difference is, but adding in, pointing it to your Fallout 4 data folder and your Fallout 4 data texture folder. Another place you can point it, which is useful if you're going to do the extraction, is point to that unpacked directory you did. And the benefit to that is that all of these files are loose, and it will 100% be able to find them. I have found that on occasion it doesn't seem to be able to open files in certain archives. I don't know if that means they're compressed incorrectly or what have you, but pointing it to that unpacked directory I think really seems to help with making sure that it can render all of your different textures. So I like to add the data and the textures folder for each. So once you've got that set up, we're going to hit apply and then save. And then we're going to go ahead and set up the double click thing like we've been doing. So we're going to go into our unpacked directory. We're going to go to meshes, and we're going to find a random mesh in here, and we're going to right click it, hit open with, and choose another app. And then we're going to navigate to Nifskope. You guys have seen me navigate enough. We'll just assume that I'm doing it correctly. You're going to check in the always use this app and hit OK. And now you'll be able to anywhere double click on a NIF file, have it show up so where you can view it in Nifskope, which I will do a Nifskope tutorial to show you how to navigate and do this type of stuff with the camera and everything. But for now, I'm going to be just showing you how to change material files. And you'll see that it shows up the correct texture and everything. And so it's really awesome to have both of those things set up, having those texture directories set up and then that double click feature. So then again, you can come into this unpacked meshes directory and just kind of surf around and get a quick look at all the different things you have available to play with. Because there are actually a lot of model files that are in there that are hard to find in the creation kit or that were never used in the creation kit but are available for all players that you could actually make use of them in your mods. So it's a great thing to go surfing through and playing around. All right, so now let's assume that we wanted to change the texture of this auto part. So one of the things I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and show you how to find a particular texture that you have on a model file. So let's say I want to edit this particular auto part. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is figure out what texture this thing is using. So there's a couple things you can do here. If you click on the actual model file, and the reason to do this clicking on is that some models you'll find are made up of a bunch of different pieces. And if you click on the texture you like, you'll make sure that you're selecting the right piece that has that texture, because it is definitely possible to have models with multiple textures on them. So let's say I want this particular texture. Then that's going to start expanding stuff on the left in Nifskope. And once you're selected on a tri-shape object, and so there's sub tri-shapes and tri-shapes, it tends to be that if you expand these down, you will eventually find something called a lighting shader property, BS lighting shader property, or BS effect shader property. And if you click on that, and then you go down in the bottom section down here into the block details, you'll see that there's a name field here. And that is pointing you to the path of that particular material file. Now, fortunately for us, Bethesda tends to follow a very strict naming scheme. And so, for example, since we found our mesh under, I believe we found it under props auto parts, and let's still confirm that since I accidentally backed out of there. They tend to follow the exact same path for their material and texture files. So likely you'd be able to find this under data materials props auto parts to get that BGSM file. And the material files are always ending in BGSM or BGEM, and SM are the shader properties that are generally for most model files. And then there's the effect, there's the BGEM, which is for the effects, and those are going to be for things like special effects like explosions and lights and things like that will have the BGEM as opposed to the BGSM. So anything that looks fancy and glowing is probably a BGEM, and the things that are more straightforward textures are going to be BGSM. So if you can't find it by going into the data materials and following the same exact path, then the other way to find it for certain is what I just showed you in Nifskope of chasing it down that way. So we're going to go ahead and go into auto parts, and we're going to find auto parts 01.bgsm. So then what I like to do here is just file save as immediately, and I'm going to save it wherever I want my particular thing. So I'm going to just save, I'm not going to actually save it because this is some working directory of I think it's from some settlements, but I don't want to add more stuff and then end up having it go into our plugin. But once you save, if you save it immediately, then if you accidentally make any edits in here, you will only be editing your original file, rather than the original file that you're expecting to be clean. So I tend to want to be careful once I start opening up files from my unpacked, because my assumption is always these unpacked files are the clean ones. And so if you start saving over them, you end up with accidental edits to things you maybe didn't mean to. All right, so once you've got your texture saved, you can go to, your material file saved, you can go to the material and you can find the path to the actual textures. So it's actually a multi-step process to even figure out necessarily which texture goes on which model. And that's an unfortunate part of working with this workflow. It's actually a real big advantage to have it extracted like this, to have it abstracted like this rather, in a way that the material files are separate from the texture files. It just gives a lot more flexibility so that you can do, especially when you talk about, once you start understanding what all these different things are, is that you can basically use the same texture multiple different ways. And since textures, as I showed you during the first phase of this video, are the biggest part of it, going from something like 12 or 15 gigabytes in the file they extract out, and they turn into about 35 gigabytes. Those are the biggest bulk of game files, so being able to reuse textures is a huge value proposition. So it's a great thing that these material files are actually separate, but it does make the workflow a little harder to find things. So there is one other trick, another way you can find the texture file that you might want to go edit, and that is in Nifskope. If you expand the shader property further, so whether it's lighting or effect, if you expand it further, you'll sometimes find this BS shader texture set. And if you're so fortunate enough to find one of those filled out, that will often have the actual texture path right there, and you can actually find it from that. So that's a great other resource to look for when you're trying to find these particular files. What I found is once you replace the material file, so if we change this, which I'll show you that in a minute, if you change this, you don't actually have to change these, though for thoroughness, I tend to also change these records if I find them. So let's talk about changing these. So let's assume you went ahead and you made your copy of this. You found your texture file. You opened it up in GIMP or Photoshop. You made your edits, and then you came into your material file and pointed to your edited DDS file. And you're all set, you've got your thing ready, and now you want it to show up on a model. Now, obviously, I showed you in the material swap tutorial that you can do this all through the creation kit. You don't actually have to do it on the model, but occasionally you'll find a reason where you have to do it on the model file. Say perhaps that you created your own custom model, or you took an existing model and you edited it in such a way that you need to save it, and it's going to make it so that the UV map and if you don't know what UV map is, don't worry about it. But maybe the UV map doesn't line up correctly with your with the vanilla texture, and so you just don't want it to be an option to use the vanilla texture. You can directly edit the NIF file and change that material. And all you have to do is, again, click on this shader property field here, and then down at the name, you're going to right-click it and hit Edit String Index, and you can actually just type in the exact path to your new texture or to your new material file. And then on this shader texture set, you can actually just double-click these fields, and you can just edit them directly and point them to your new thing. So unfortunately, it does involve some either direct typing, or what I tend to do is just copy and paste. So for example, I would copy the path here, and you only want to grab everything after data. So you just want, so if you're doing a material file, you'd grab materials, props, auto parts, etc. And then the name of my file. So I might grab this and just hit Control A and Control C to copy that whole thing. I do find that when I'm modding on all my computers, I've tended to do this, is I actually set it up to show the file extension, and I don't remember exactly how you do that. Let's see if I can find it really quickly. So yeah, I'm not finding it quickly, so I'm not going to cover that in this video. That's something you can find if you just go Google that, like how do I show my file extensions at all times. It's a quick and easy thing to do. I find it very easy for things like that, where I end up having to grab the whole file name and paste it. It's also nice for when you're working with mod files, because they have such bizarre custom formats. It's nice to be able to just see at a glance, no matter what the actual format is, so I know what I have to do with that file. Especially if you get into sound files, there's all sorts of wacky file extensions for sound files to get them as small as necessary for video games. So I really like having the file extension shown, and then you can just copy paste the path and then copy paste the file name, etc. into Nifskope. So that should cover all of those tools. So you now know the general workflow for customizing textures and actually finding the textures for the thing you're trying to modify. I would definitely recommend, if you're going to get into texture modifying, you go watch my material swap video, so you know different ways you can change the material files that don't involve you editing NIFs, because another disadvantage to you doing it at the NIF level is then you have to include that model file with your mod as well, instead of just the material or just the texture file. You suddenly have to include also a model file, so you're adding a lot of bulk to your mod for not necessarily any particular gain. So generally, you want to use that material swap method. But yeah, you guys now know all the workflow involved for creating textures, for creating material files, and for setting up Nifskope for easy use. So hopefully that's useful to you guys. I do have a couple more of these videos in mind where I give you just a bunch of random tidbits of useful information. What I'm trying to do with this series in general right now in these early phases of it is try and get to as many broad topics as possible and give you guys enough information so that you can get started and start digging in. We'll get into more narrow things further down the line once I feel like I've gotten a base covered for everything, because it also allows me to piggyback onto my older tutorials, knowing that I can point you to another one to get specific information. So guys, I hope you're enjoying the series, and stay tuned next week for more Bethesda Mod School.